Welcome to Sound Bites, hosted by registered dietitian nutritionist Melissa Joy Dobbins. Let's delve into the science, the psychology, and the strategies behind good food and nutrition.
Hello, and welcome back to the Sound Bites podcast. Today's episode is about carbohydrates, and specifically the latest science on defining quality carbohydrates and what is needed for future carbohydrate guidance. I have two expert guests today. I have Dr. Sid Angadi and Dr. Julie Miller-Jones. This episode is a collaboration between Sound Bites and Potatoes USA, the nation's potato marketing and research organization, representing more than 2,500 potato farming families. Potatoes USA is committed to providing the nutrition science community with evidence-based information about the role of potatoes in healthy lifestyles. But this episode is about carbohydrates, of which potatoes are a starchy vegetable, so we will be touching on them. But the overall arching conversation that we have today, again, is about quality carbohydrates and what that means. So I'm really excited to introduce you to my guest experts. Dr. Sid Angadi is a cardiovascular physiologist whose work focuses on the effects and interactions of exercise, drugs, and diet in healthy individuals and in chronic disease. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology at the University of Virginia and has published a significant body of work examining the weight-independent effects of diet and exercise with regard to reducing cardiovascular risk. My second guest is Dr. Julie Miller-Jones, a certified nutrition scientist and certified food scientist and professor emerita from St. Catherine University in St. Paul, Minnesota. She's a frequent speaker for many professional conferences and consumer organizations locally, nationally, and internationally on carbohydrates, grains and whole grains, diets, and food safety. And actually, she was on the podcast before, back in episode 94, hands down my most popular episode called The Whole Truth About Grains. So welcome you both to the show.
Thanks for having us.
It's great to be on again, and thanks so much for the kind introduction.
My pleasure. So as always, after I introduce my guests, I really want my guests to share more about their background. So I would love to hear how you got interested in this field or the specific work that you're doing related to carbohydrates, anything that you would like to share with our listeners so we can get to know you a little bit better. And of course, as always, any disclosures that you have to note. So let's start with you, Dr. Sid Angadi.
I have two disclosures. I serve on the Scientific Advisory Board for the Grain Foods Foundation, and I'm also on the Scientific Advisory Committee for the Quality Carbohydrate Coalition. So as a cardiovascular physiologist, what I'm really looking at most of the times is how exercise, drugs, and diet interact in the setting of, more often than not, chronic disease. So my specialty is really heart failure. And more recently, I've been looking at mitigating the effects of cardiotoxic chemotherapies. But in the past couple of years, I've also examined how foods interact with cardiovascular function. And specifically, there are strategies that can be used to mitigate some of the cardiovascular issues that can be seen with certain foods. And that's how I sort of got involved in this area.
Excellent. Thank you. And can I call you Sid or Dr. Angadi? What would you prefer?
Sid is great.
Okay, great. Thank you. And Dr. Julie Miller-Jones, my listeners may be familiar with you, but just in case, would love to hear more about your background and your work as well.
Well, I've been interested in grains partly because of where I live. And I live in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the American Association of Cereal Chemists had its headquarters here. And I always told students that they should be involved in all the scientific organizations they possibly could. So I started early with both the Food Technology and the Dietetics Association and the Food and Consumer Science Association and the National Council Against Health Fraud. But one of them was a cereal chem. And so because of that, then I got on the nutrition part of that association and worked on the definition of what's a whole grain, what's a whole grain food, and about what is the role of cereals in the diet. So that's one of the ways I got into carbohydrate. The other is I've always been interested in diets, and the low-carb diet has been around since I was a teenager. In fact, true confession, I went on it. And so I then became a professor, and I was always trying to look at what is the role of carbohydrates in the diet, and do we need any? And so that's one of the ways I really became interested in this topic.
Excellent. And we get into your story back in episode 94 about your dieting and a lot about grains and carbohydrates. And then we even added on a little like chemistry lesson at the end in the outro. So I really encourage people to go check that out. Julie, you'll remember back in the day that this was about 3 years ago. And before I released the episode, I played it in the car for my 70-year-old mom and my 10-year-old son. And they both were like so just glued to the audio and what you were saying. And they both got a lot out of it. So I was like, well, this is something for everyone, I guess. But what I'd like to do is set the stage before we dive into all things carbohydrates. It's a really confusing topic and maybe somewhat polarized topic, but it just seems like there's a lot of confusion about carbohydrates and the role of carbohydrates in the diet. You know, we see this playing out with like the keto diet, the paleo diet, and just in general, this idea to, you know, cut carbs or limit carbs. And, you know, I'm a dietitian, but I'm also a certified diabetes educator. So this is in my world all the time. There's a lot of myths and misperceptions about carbohydrates and quote unquote starchy foods. And even some of our health professional colleagues disparage starchy foods, potatoes, starchy vegetables in general, not to mention, you know, white foods, when they emphasize like eating the rainbow. And, you know, it's interesting because starchy foods like nutrient-rich vegetables like potatoes, they've been misrepresented in the media. And like I mentioned, even among the nutrition science community, you know, as foods that should be limited. So I'd like to start off with having both of you weigh in on what does the current nutrition guidance say about carbohydrates? So, Dr. Julie Miller-Jones, can I call you Julie or Dr. Julie? What would you like?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Julie is great.
Okay. Julie, would you like to weigh in on that first? And if Dr. Sid has any additions, then he can weigh in as well.
Actually, the National Academy of Sciences recommends that people get 45 to 65% of their calories from nutrient-rich carbohydrate foods. That's like fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains, nuts, seeds, starchy roots and tubers like potatoes. It does not include what I call doodles, ding-dongs, and donuts, which are the things that are not recommended in any plate or pyramid. Those are sugar, salt, and calorie-laden and not nutrient-rich. Mm-hmm. But recently, there was a study in Lancet which showed that people who ate half of their calories as carbohydrate lived 4 years longer than people who ate far less or people who ate far more. So the sweet spot is about half your plate in terms of living longest. The only exception to the 45 to 65% is that some diabetes educators find that if they go to 40%, that is helpful. And Melissa, you might want to weigh in on that. Should you go even lower than 45, which is recommended by the Academy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think 40 sounds reasonable. And of course, it would have to be individualized to the person. If that little extra tweak helped them, that would seem reasonable because then that leaves, 60% of your calories between, fat and protein. And see how I did the math there. And of course, there's plenty of heart healthy fats to choose from. And I talk about protein a lot on the podcast. And there's a lot of research out there that speaks to the RDA versus the AMDR, that acceptable macronutrient distribution range, which can be quite a large range, as you know. I mean, we've got these 3 macronutrients. Between the 3 of them, we're looking at adding up to 100% of our calories. So certainly there can be and would be some fluctuation there or some wiggle room there. But going below 40 for carbohydrate, I don't see that being realistic or necessary. But Julie, what else can you tell us about this current carbohydrate guidance? And, you've noted that, it's a diverse group. We're not just, when we talk about carbs, we're not just talking about grains. We're not just talking about starches. We've got the fruits and vegetables, and you mentioned legumes. So what else can you tell us about this diverse group and the current guidance?
For a 2,000 calorie diet, the most recent Dietary Guidelines recommends 5 cups a week, or the equivalent of starchy vegetables. They recommend that.
I didn't know that.
Just behind the most recommended, the highest recommended, is red and orange and yellow vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually, they recognize the need for starchy vegetables. In terms of whole and refined grains, they recommend that we have approximately, for a 2,000 calorie diet, approximately 5 1-ounce equivalents of grains. That's about, if a slice of bread is about 80 calories and we eat 5 a day, you can see that's between 450 and 500 calories. Mm-hmm. And so we have a fourth of the calories there coming from grains and another from the carbohydrates like starchy vegetables. And then we add in what we want to do is the more plant-based diet, so that we have some of our entrees coming from legumes and some of our snacks coming from nuts and seeds. That's the way we get to that 50% of our calories as healthy carbohydrates.
Yeah, I think some people think, that you're just eating pasta all day and that's all your carbs. But there's quite a bit going on there. I want to back up a little bit, and maybe Sid, you want to weigh in on this, talking about how carbohydrates are the body's preferred source of energy.
Sure. The interesting thing is that, as you mentioned earlier, there's a lot of talk about cutting carbs, but I think it's important to take a much more holistic view of food and not take such a reductive sort of view in the first place. Mm-hmm. Things are more than just calories more often than not. And I'd just like to add a little bit also to what Julie said, which is I think it's important to recognize that carbohydrates sort of form the baseline on which a lot of heart-healthy diets are built as well, like, for example, the DASH diet, which is the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. But then getting back to the question you asked, which is talking about how carbs are the body's preferred source of energy, the interesting thing is that carbs are the predominant fuel obviously used by the brain, but also that they stimulate their own oxidation. And they're tremendously useful, especially when you're performing higher intensity physical activity. In fact, many years ago, there was a very interesting study that looked at the diets of world-class Kenyan marathoners. And the reason why they looked at Kenyan marathoners was because the top 95 or so, or out of the top 100 marathon times, are from Kenyan marathoners. Specifically, they're from one tribe called the Kalenjin, and about 70% of their daily calories came from carbohydrate. So carbs are really the fuel of choice for high-intensity activity as well. And that's largely because you just get more ATP or more energy per liter oxygen compared to all the other fuels. So if you want to be fast, carbs are the way to go. Mm-hmm. But yeah, carbs are a choice of fuel for your brain. And the other thing to keep in mind is we are not particularly good at storing carbohydrate, which is why we keep needing to consume them frequently.
Yeah, we can only store so much glycogen in the muscle,
right,
versus, our fat stores kind of unlimited there. So back to carbohydrates, as I mentioned, as a dietitian and a certified diabetes educator, I know from firsthand experience that carbohydrates are diverse, and we've talked about that. But from a nutrition science perspective, let's talk more about these complexities of carbohydrate-containing foods.
Well, carbohydrates really are very, very complex, not just in the simple versus complex, but they are really difficult to often explain to people why they are so important. For instance, we have high fiber foods, and some of the fibers that are in carbohydrates are only in carbohydrate foods, and they're not found in fruits and vegetables. So when people say, well, you don't need to eat those grains or those potatoes because you can get what you need in something else, that's simply not true. The fibers are in fact different, and they have different physiological functions. We want different kinds of fiber. And in fact, we know that cereal fibers do some things and vegetable fibers do other things. And those fibers, let's say maybe in a potato, are doing a different thing and trapping the starch in a different way. We get different glycemic and other impacts by how big the carbohydrate molecule is, what its particle size is. For instance, let's just take oatmeal. If you want the most cholesterol lowering from your oatmeal, you'd like to buy quick oats, not instant, quick. Because by opening the structure of the grain, you actually release the beta-glucan. It's more available at the gut level, and the beta-glucan then can actually impede cholesterol absorption from the gut. Whereas if you want more laxation, you would like to eat a steel-cut oat or an old-fashioned oat. Or if you want more glucose control, it will leave more slowly from a particle that's slow to digest, like an old-fashioned oat or a steel-cut oat. They're all great foods. They all contain fiber, the beta-glucan, which can control glucose passage into the bloodstream, how quickly it goes. They all are fermented in the large bowel to short-chain fatty acids, but you just get that little nuance of difference from different kinds of processing. Now, because I don't have any particular problem, I try to use a variety is a good way to go for any kind of nutrition thing. And so pick a variety of kinds of things and different ways of eating a food just such as oats, just as an example.
Yep.
The matrix makes a big difference in terms of the bioactives, as some carbohydrates have lots of things they come in with. Some come in pretty clean, so you need the phytonutrients and the nutrients, and that's all a package to look at.
Yeah, so you mentioned the food matrix. Can you explain that a little bit for our listeners? It sounds like it's the package, like everything that comes with it.
Well, for instance, there's something called resistant starch, and resistant starch comes in 5 different forms. But one kind of resistant starch is simply the fact that in the time that the food is in the digestive tract, the enzymes can't penetrate the wheat kernel or the corn kernel. The starch that's held inside the kernel actually doesn't get digested. It doesn't yield calories that are absorbed. It only can produce a few calories when it moves to the large bowel and is subsequently fermented to short-chain fatty acids. And to be a little bit non-dinner time talk, if you've ever in corn season happened to look at the output, which you have, you might see kernels of corn in the stool. And that just is an indication that some of the starch that was in that corn didn't get attacked by the enzyme. That's one kind of resistant starch. So there's a lot of kinds of, and that's held in the matrix of the food. So that's an example of something being held in the matrix. Some people feel that all fibers should be natural fibers because they think that the natural matrix makes the fiber more physiologically active. I don't adhere to that policy. I just talked about the effect of processing oats. So you can get some advantages by opening the structure up and letting the fiber function in the upper gut, and sometimes you want it to function in the lower gut. So then something that isn't necessarily in the matrix may be more helpful, so that you need both.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about the different kinds of fiber, we're going way beyond soluble versus insoluble. You know, you mentioned cereal versus vegetable. There's so many different types of fiber. I should do an episode on that. Maybe you can come and talk about that, and resistant starch, which we really don't hear about much. I didn't know that there were different kinds of resistant starch. So this is all very interesting and just speaks to the complexity.
Yes, you're right that carbohydrates are incredibly complex, but it's also important to remember that different macronutrients are consumed in different contexts along with sometimes different foods. And they can favorably interact, for instance. So a number of years ago, we carried out an interesting little study in which we brought in a bunch of adolescents and we fed them a high-fat meal and examine their vascular function at the end, following the high-fat meal. And sure enough, you consume a high-fat meal, your triglycerides go up, your vascular function goes down. But when we fed these individuals the exact same meal, but then we tacked on all brand cereal with that, which had a lot of insoluble fiber. What we saw was a lot of these abnormalities in vascular function largely were ameliorated.
Wow.
And this was largely driven by the suppression of postprandial triglycerides, post-meal increases in triglyceride. And so again, getting back to what I originally said, it's important to view food within the context of what it's consumed as well, and how they interact with each other, I think is an often ignored part of the whole equation as well.
Yes, great point. And we do tend to talk about nutrients, and even if we're talking about a specific food, and we're going to get into this with the glycemic index in a little bit, but, what about the diet pattern? And I'm sure, I know that there's limitations in research to study all of this, but the closer we can get to what happens in real life, the more applicable the results and outcomes can be. So you're both carbohydrate experts and part of the Scientific Advisory Council of the Quality Carbohydrate Coalition. So I'd love to hear each of you tell a little bit more about this work that you're doing.
I got involved primarily as a physiologist to sort of help parse the data in terms of the body's physiological responses in the post-meal period following the consumption of different nutrients, and in this case it was carbohydrate. And one of the things that we've noticed across the board as someone that's been running clinical trials that have looked at acute studies with food and diet per se, is that you see substantial heterogeneity in responses to foods. And when you see these largely heterogeneous responses, it becomes really difficult then to go back and look at markers. For example, the glycemic index, which are sort of almost sold as being written in stone, but then when you start examining them in physiological context, you see that they've got such huge variability. That's obviously a problem. We started talking about that, and that's part of the reason why I got involved in this process.
Interesting. You said the word heterogeneity, and I'll admit, this is kind of a newer word for me in the last year or so. So that just means there's a lot of variety and a lot of variability, right?
Right. So it's huge variability in people's responses to carbohydrate consumption. The thing to understand here is that to some extent, these responses are driven by the food you consume. But on the flip side, these responses are also driven by things such as your age, your genetics, which is your family history, whether you exercise or not, and so on. And so there are these markers that are thought to be driven primarily by the food that you consume, but in reality, what you find out is that it is a massive interaction between the food, the person, and the environment, and it makes drawing conclusions from these sorts of markers particularly difficult.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Yes. And of course, we see this with patients all the time. One person can have, white rice and they're fine. The other person, they might need to switch over to the brown rice and then they're fine. So that's really interesting. Julie, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, well, I started the Scientific Advisory Council was really the outshoot from a group of scientists were called to talk about carbohydrate quality after there was an international paper said there was a consensus on carbohydrate quality. And the consensus was that glycemic index defined carbohydrate quality. But the problem with the consensus is that it was a little like what I call the coalition of the willing, in that they only invited scientists who were in favor of the glycemic index. So it was their consensus, but it wasn't a universal consensus. And so it really bothered us that if the glycemic index is an indication of carbohydrate quality, then a Mars bar would get a good score and a whole grain bread or a potato would get a terrible score.
Yeah.
And so there were a number of reasons why we thought this was just wrong. And then that led to the current council, which has more scientists on it. And we're trying to put together an algorithm which will help consumers decide what is a quality carbohydrate, and it will be based on what nutrients does it deliver, what fiber does it deliver, is it a whole grain or not, all kinds of characteristics, not just one simple variable measure, which is the glycemic response. And so we know that rice is important in Asian and Latin American cultures. We know that these carbohydrates really are meaningful. And so we wanted to also look at various diets and cultural eating patterns so that when we make a nutrition recommendation, it can fit for all different kinds of individuals and their traditions.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And we're going to talk more about that. And I really appreciate the cultural inclusivity aspect. It's just so important for just real world, real life, real people, and that application.
Yeah, I was just going to say, just a quick little add-on to what Julie was saying, is that there's a really high prevalence of binary thinking that goes on when it comes to nutrition. And I think that is something we really as a field sort of need to step away from. And to some extent is not particularly helpful.
Right.
And more importantly, as we've talked about with this variability, that really creates problems. And so when we talk about the generation of this algorithm, as Julie was indicating, we go beyond just the usual suspects, but looking at things like whole grain intake, looking at fiber content and so on. The goal is there to get a holistic view of what makes a quality carbohydrate rather than it being based off just one thing.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. So before we talk a little bit more about glycemic index, I do want to make sure that we cover where the scientific dialogue around carbohydrate quality is right now, because I know that we've touched on a few things, but what is this current conversation including and not including?
A couple of things to keep in mind is that the current scientific conversation is largely being driven by a fair amount of epidemiological research, which is fine as a hypothesis building enterprise, but it's also important to recognize that that's the first step in developing the hierarchy of science and the hierarchy of evidence, which eventually the highest level of evidence would be a randomized control trial or a clinical trial. And so what you have is fairly lower quality evidence that's coming through from these epidemiological studies. The other thing also to keep in mind is, as I've alluded to previously, is that foods or nutrients are not consumed in isolation. They're consumed as parts of a larger meal. And that complicates things considerably. And so a lot of this reductive conversation around single nutrients or single indices really ignores that. And I think causes a lot of confusion from the perspective of a patient or a consumer.
Absolutely.
Another problem is that much of the epidemiological research is done with some kind of food intake data, often a food frequency, which asks you, how many times did you eat broccoli this week? Or how many times did you eat potatoes this week? Well, first of all, we're not very good at actually remembering that. And data show that we eat more broccoli and drink less gin than we actually do, or state we do that on a food frequency. But in addition, the food frequency might just say white bread. I already told you there are hundreds of different glycemic indexes for different kinds of white bread. So the number that is used in some of this epidemiological research can be very flawed because it doesn't tell you how it was cooked. And as Sid mentioned, what's eaten with it. So that's a really big problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've already mentioned this, as a certified diabetes educator, working with carbohydrates all the time. I find the glycemic index confusing for patients and just generally not helpful. So I never really used it. I didn't feel that it had real life applications when you talk about glycemic index, even versus glycemic load. You've said quite a bit about glycemic index, but I wanted to know if there's anything else you wanted to point out regarding, the limitations of it. And maybe specifically regarding potatoes and how we don't consume potatoes just by themselves. They're not bananas. We don't just sit there and eat a potato. So what else would you like to add regarding the glycemic index?
It may be useful in a laboratory setting. Its applicability to a person eating a meal may be very limited, which is problematic for many reasons in that, for instance, the Sydney Glycemic Index table, the University of Sydney in Australia, has 117 different glycemic indices for different kinds of white rice based on its variety, based on the amount of amylose, which is a resistant starch, based on not even just whether it's white or brown. This is just white rice, how much water it was cooked with, how long it was cooked. And so most people using a glycemic index table, it's really, really a dartboard whether the value that you picked had anything to do with what you ate. And then if I butter the bread, the glycemic index goes way down. In fact, most people don't even know that the glycemic index is based on 50 grams of available carbohydrate. What that means is that to get 50 grams of available carbohydrate from a refined enriched white bread, you need about 3 slices. To get 50 grams of available carbohydrate from whole grain bread, you need almost 4 slices. Because of the fiber present in the bread, that carbohydrate is not available. So you look at the table, and whole grain bread and white bread have a very similar glycemic index. But the amount eaten is different to get the 50 grams of available carbohydrate. Most people do not understand that. And that's the reason the Mars bar, it's a little tiny Mars bar compared to almost 4 slices of whole grain bread. It makes no sense in a way. So that's one problem with it. It's way too simplistic. And it even on the same person, the variability when we do just a single standard food within a person is great, much less among people. And so that's really, really problematic.
Absolutely agree. In fact, one of the issues with the way in which we assess GI is if you look at the standards that are used to establish the glycemic index of a food, you take only about 10 people, you feed them a portion of the food which contains 50 grams of digestible carbohydrate, you measure the glucose area under the curve, and then you give them a reference food, which is either glucose or white bread, and that's how you get the glycemic index. This is a really limited sample when you do things like that. The interesting thing is what happens when you then try and extrapolate this to really large populations. So, in 2015, there was this really elegant study in which they had about 800 people in whom they fed about 47,000 different meals. They essentially looked to see what was going on with glycemic responses in these individuals. When you look at the data there, I think it is very telling. And the reason why I say that is because if you just look at the variability of glycemic responses to things like glucose in bread, you had almost a 5-fold variation between the bottom 10th and the top 10th percentile. So imagine if you had a literal yardstick, but that yardstick, depending on the person that's using it, was either 1 yard or 5 yards. You would then look and say, well, that's not a particularly useful yardstick now, is it? But that's part of the problem. When you use something like GI, that's really tricky.
And I'm not the only health professional who seems to feel that the glycemic index is confusing. There was a national survey in 2020 among registered dietitians, nearly 800 nutrition professionals, that found nearly 3/4 do not use the glycemic index when counseling patients. And 3 out of 5 believe that the glycemic index is actually stopping people from eating perfectly healthy foods. So I'm not alone, I guess, in that opinion. We're not trying to bash the glycemic index here, but we really need to look at this more holistically. So we've talked about the problem and the challenge and some of the ideas about how this conversation can be more meaningful and holistic. Is there anything else you wanted to say before we really kind of start sharing some of the vision and the recommendations and the ideas moving forward?
I just like to share the result of one meta-analysis, which looked at really a large number of clinical trials and almost 5,000 adults. And there was no consistent benefit of changing the glycemic index of a diet, even in a randomized clinical trial, in this large meta-analysis. So I think that shows that the randomized clinical trial, which is the gold standard, as Sid mentioned, kind of says that what we're seeing in the epidemiological study may be more about what was in the diets that were low glycemic rather than the glycemic index itself. It may have to do with the characteristics of the individual. And the data quality of many of the epi studies, which is probably the reason that a lot of dietitians don't use it, is ranked low to very low only in the case of lowering hemoglobin A1C and a couple other glucose measures. In an umbrella review, was it given a moderate quality? Mostly it's the data quality when it's graded is very, very low because there is so much variability.
That makes sense.
I'm not trying to bash epidemiological research, but one of the things to keep in mind when you're looking at nutrition epidemiology, and Julie alluded to this previously, is that a lot of this is done based on food-based recalls, and these are memory-based. The problem is when you actually look at the values you get out of these sort of instruments, you don't get particularly useful numbers, and you get incredibly high degrees of variability. In fact, studies have shown that when you look at nutrition recall information, say from NHANES, which is a National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, close to almost half of the food recall information, specifically with regard to caloric intake, was compatible with someone that might be comatose, but definitely not compatible with someone that's, leading a vertical upright existence. And that's, a big problem. And when you look at under and over reporting, almost, 3/5 of the data are really, really problematic. And so when you look at these epidemiological studies, just recognize that these are meant to generate hypotheses that really should be tested in clinical trials. But you have to be really careful drawing strong conclusions from epidemiological data.
No, thank you for sharing that. We talk about that a lot on the podcast, the limitations inherent in nutrition research and how not everything can be a randomized control trial and the role of epi studies. So I appreciate you lending that perspective and reminder for us, because the outputs or the outcomes are only as good as the inputs. And like you said, a lot of variability there. And of course, just, human nature, memory issues with not being able to be very accurate with that. So thank you for sharing that.
I'd just like to add that there are some kinds of things that Glycemic Index categorizes as ones we should not choose. When you do the epi studies, which we've just talked about, whole grains lowers the risk of most diseases in epi studies. But what is not reported is that refined grains are neutral. So while they're not as good in terms they don't lower, it doesn't make them bad like some people say. And I think potatoes suffered from that a little bit too, and they don't recognize that a potato is an excellent source of vitamin C and has more potassium than a banana. And these kinds of things get lost when we talk about picking a food by its glycemic response. And then it really, really depends on whether you eat it with fat, which many people do. An interesting study for you and as a diabetes educator is that you got a better overnight glycemic response by choosing a high glycemic index potato dish than a low glycemic index basmati rice. These kinds of things are important to know and for dietitians to know because that overnight change in glucose for diabetics must be managed to have a successful person who is a very strict diabetic.
I'll just add to that. When I worked in a high-risk OB clinic, I was shocked to find that, it's a pretty unique population, whether it's gestational diabetes or, pregnant women with type 2 or type 1 diabetes. But especially with the gestational diabetes patients, we found and we encouraged the pregnant women to consume a half a cup of ice cream, like regular ice cream at bedtime snack, because that perfect mix of carbs and fat helped delay their blood glucose rise. And we saw much better fasting glucose in the morning. So we've talked about how there is a lack of a standardized definition for quality carbohydrates and the glycemic index is flawed or very flawed. But I'd like to hear your perspective in terms of how to best define quality carbohydrates and what is the work that you're currently doing in this area to define quality carbohydrates?
We really were concerned that foods that are important on people's tables, that are culturally important, and have nourished us for millennia, were being not considered as quality. We realize that there are products, many carbohydrate snacks and desserts that should be eaten infrequently, but we really wanted to be able to define what is a quality carbohydrate food. And we decided that there needed to be at least 40% of the energy coming from carbohydrate and that it was a solid food. Partly because we know, most people know that sugar-sweetened beverages are not a quality carbohydrate. They also know that broccoli, while it has a little carbohydrate, is a quality food. So we only wanted to focus on those foods which were solid foods and delivered a significant part of their energy from carbohydrates. And that would be things that often were, as you called them, starchy. They would be potatoes, pastas, rices, breads, and cereals. And then what do we think is important here? And we know that people who eat, for instance, breakfast cereals have a better nutritional profile than people who don't eat ready-to-eat breakfast cereals. How can we capture the nutrients and the fiber that potato brings? And so we tried to set up an algorithm that looked at the nutrients, the fiber, those things that would really give quality. Things that we gave negative scores to were the added sugar or added salt, so that people could evaluate, well, yes, a cereal may have added sugar, it may have added salt, but when you look at the entire score, is it something that could rank as quality? And we're finding that a number of foods can have some sugar and some salt and still be considered a quality carbohydrate. And so that's what we're trying to do, and to look at other kinds of tubers and things that are used in a variety of cultures and have always been basic staples in that culture.
That sounds like it makes a lot of sense. I like it.
Yeah, and just to add to what Julie said, one of the main things there was to make sure we considered all the other things that went into these carbohydrate-containing foods, like fiber, food processing, and so on, because these relate to physiological responses to meals. They relate to biomarkers such as lipids, blood glucose, insulin, and so on, blood pressure, which are related to long-term cardiometabolic risk. And so that nutrient density that Julie alluded to is particularly important because it can make a mark on these biomarkers, which can then alter health in the long run as well. And that's another reason for having a more expansive definition of what constitutes a quality carbohydrate.
We were even looking at things like phytochemicals, and were they considered a whole grain or a vegetable, because those things would be coming in with the nutrients. So we tried to really look at this in a very global way.
Right. It's like it's nutrient density like 2.0. Like there's even more that you're considering, like with the cultural and everything that's going into this.
By the way, protein and fat have degrees of quality already defined. And we talk about fats in that we want fats that are unsaturated, or we want fats that have omega-3s in them. And so we've had some degree of differentiation on what we want the fat to have. And we haven't really done that in an organized way with carbohydrate.
Right. That's a really good point. And we have something similar with protein as well, but we don't have that with carbohydrate. So let's talk about any insights you can share about future nutrition science on carbohydrate quality that we should be on the lookout for. As we wrap up, I've got some takeaway questions for you.
I think Sid early on mentioned the DASH diet. We know that there are people who abuse carbohydrates. They eat more than the recommended amount for their degree of calories. This contributes to problems that can occur because of too many calories, but I think the carbs are being blamed for it. So I think one of the things that people need to think about is that when we're looking at carbohydrate quality, we need to look at it as its role in the diet. Are people eating the right amount of those carbohydrates as part of the other important balanced components of the diet. Are too many servings of a carbohydrate easing out or squeezing out the important fruits and vegetables, so that we can actually want to make sure that the carbohydrates that they're choosing are ones that deliver the nutrients, and then help consumers choose the right number of those in a day so that they are balancing it with the other foods that they need.
We're engaged in this long-term iterative process in terms of developing this algorithm. And so we've only published one manuscript on that, which provided some rationale as to why we were trying to develop a new algorithm for defining carbohydrate quality. We're now in the process of developing that algorithm. And as we've mentioned before, it takes a much more expansive view of carbohydrate-containing foods. And I think our follow-up is going to be to then use the algorithm that is generated and apply it to different dietary patterns across cultures, potentially look at health effects and so on, and try to figure out how it turns out. So this is going to be an ongoing process. We're probably not going to get the right answer right away, but hopefully it's a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm. And I like that you're bringing multiple parties to the table to kind of have this brain trust. It's not a simple answer. It's complex. See how I did that? Did not mean to do that. So as we're wrapping up, I have a few questions about takeaways. So what would you like the research community to take away from the science around carbohydrates today? Sid, maybe we'll start with you.
What I would primarily say is just that when you're looking at carbohydrates, avoid reductive binary thinking. It depends on context. It depends on the foods that you pair them with. It depends on you in a lot of ways. Far too often, that aspect is ignored. Just to use a really simple example, a lot of people get hung up on the issue of carbohydrates and body weight or obesity. But what we know from about 3 or 4 decades of obesity physiology research is that the majority of the variance in body weight comes from genetics. In fact, the heritability of body weight is equivalent to that of height. So when we spend so much time talking about this one macronutrient and its association with obesity, we're literally ignoring the forest for the trees. We're ignoring the elephant in the room and going for small potatoes. And I don't think it's particularly helpful from a scientific perspective, not to say that don't do research, but I think we have to be really careful when we present this research, and specifically in the way that we talk about it to the consumer or patients or subjects.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, I would like to see some of the epidemiological studies redone. I would like them to look at the recommended carbohydrate ratio. First of all, look at, are they eating the recommended number of servings? Is that part of the problem? And look at that in relationship to the fruits and vegetables and things that are recommended. So I think we are labeling carbohydrate as bad, just as we labeled fat as bad in the hopes we would solve our problems. I think that's a dangerous strategy. I think we need to look at it more in the amount of carbohydrate compared to the amount of other fruits and vegetables, the amount of carbohydrate compared to the amount, so that we're looking at more a pattern. And so it's not the meat and potatoes pattern, but it's the carbs, no vegetable pattern. I'd really like to see us do that. I would like the grain data to have 4 buckets. Instead of whole grains versus refined grains, I would like whole grain staple foods recommended, whole grain indulgent foods, of which there are almost none or were almost none when these studies were done. There are a few now. Refined grains recommended foods and refined grain indulgent foods, because I think that will give a different perspective on what we think of refined grains, because half the calories and half the foods, when we look at those data, in the refined grain category are non-recommended. So what we're saying is that those who eat the non-recommended foods are at higher risk. And that's what I'd really like people to look at in terms of further research.
Thank you. And for our listeners, that was a big takeaway from episode 94, that Julie explains in detail that the doodles, ding-dongs, and donuts were lumped into all refined grains. And that has to influence the outcome, or at least you need to know that when you're looking at what the outcomes are. So along those lines, what advice would each of you share about how healthcare professionals can provide nutrition education to patients and clients about carbohydrates and carbohydrate foods like potatoes?
My go-to paper is that Seidelman paper, where those people who ate half their calories as carbohydrates, and let's make those carbohydrates potatoes and whole grain breads and enriched refined grains in the right amount and legumes. When they eat those as 50% of their calories, they lived longer than people who did anything else. And I think that we really need to really concentrate that we are supposed to eat carbohydrates, and we didn't, as the paleo people, we did evolve to eat carbohydrates, and there's cave evidence that we did. And so if we look at diets over time, carbohydrates are very important, and they're very popular. So I just think we need to tell consumers that it's okay to eat carbohydrates. If you need to count them if you have diabetes, but you need to include them because they do important things for your diet.
Mm-hmm. This is pretty similar, so I'm not sure if there would be a different answer to this, but just in general, how can we as a nutrition community make sure that consumers know which carbohydrate-containing foods are the most nutritious and the highest quality? And that's the work that you're doing now, but any advice there?
I was going to say that's sort of TBD.
Yep. Okay.
The short answer is, what are the things the Dietary Guidelines Committee say that we're missing? We don't get enough fiber, and we get over half of our fiber in the diet from grains and potatoes. Mm-hmm. What aren't we getting enough of? Potassium. Mm-hmm. Potato is a good source of potassium, better than the well-known banana. Mm-hmm. So to really think, how do we address the dietary disparities that we have? We can do it with inexpensive foods that people really enjoy. Mm-hmm. And so I think, need to reframe that this isn't a bad food. It's one we need to include, and we need to include it in the right amount.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you. And then one more nuance to that, because I talk about sensational headlines and how they're not the bottom line takeaways that people really need to make meaningful changes in their diets. So whether you're a health professional or a consumer, how can we look past some of these headlines and dig a little deeper when we're trying to figure out this nutrition science or this nutrition research information? Always read the primary source. One of the biggest problems when you're talking about nutrition research, or for that matter, actually the reporting of science, far too often it's heavily sensationalized. Mm-hmm. It's not uncommon to read an article that says drinking a glass of red wine is just like exercise. And then there was actually an article that came out years ago about that. But then when you read it, A, it was in mice. B, the resveratrol dose was the equivalent of drinking 12 bottles of wine a day. The problem is that far too often people are looking for a macronutrient or micronutrient of the day, which is going to quote unquote change your life or save your life or what have you. And real life, real physiology is a lot more complex than that. And anytime you see a headline that essentially says that, pause, read the primary source, and more often than not, what you're going to find is that the primary source doesn't quite support the breathless claims that are made in the news report. Thank you. I appreciate how you put all that. I love asking my guests these questions because, you get a unique answer with consensus. It's interesting. Julie, anything to add about those pesky headlines?
Since everyone can't always access the primary source, just some simple things to be wary of. Epidemiological data shows association. It is frequently in headlines and in articles as causation. Mm-hmm. Know that it's an association. The sale of running shoes is associated with the rise of obesity. And we know that's silly. Mm-hmm. But both of them happen to climb at the same time. That's what an association is. They just happen to vary together.
Right.
So look for that. Know that nutrition, like any science, is evolutionary, not revolutionary. So if something completely sounds like it doesn't fit the rest of the data, be very careful to evaluate that and try to find other sources, and try to look for sources that are quality sources. Ask your dietitian because she or he will be able to help.
You touched on 2 or 3 of the points that I like to make. And, one study is not going to change the existing body of evidence. And you talk about the association. So the way I like to explain that is the association is a correlation. It's not that cause and effect. You use the example of running shoes and obesity. And this is one that I like to use, is that sales of ice cream or ice cream consumption and drownings both go up in the summertime in warm weather. But certainly that's an association. That is not a cause and effect. That would be terrible if it was. But there's a third variable, the warm weather, that impacts both of those. So that's something that I like to share when I do my media trainings with health professionals, or to encourage them, like, this is a simple example or analogy that you can share with your patients. So thank you both for weighing in on the pesky headlines. Where can people go for more information related to the latest science on quality carbohydrates? Is there a website that you can share?
APRI is a good site, the Alliance for Potato Research and Education.
And that's APRI, APRE.org.
Right. And the Grains Food Foundation will have articles about whole grains and refined grains. Those are just a number of websites, and I can get you more if you need them.
Thank you, Julie. Oh, and I do want to be sure to mention the Potato Goodness website. It's potatogoodness.com. That is Potato USA's main resource for health professionals. So there's recipes, nutrition information. You can sign up for their newsletter. And there's a professionals section that has materials, research, handouts, and news. So I'll be sure to have those links and other resources in my show notes at soundbitesrd.com. And also, Sid, you mentioned the first manuscript that is published in Nutrients, and I have a link to that, as well as some other articles from the APRI site. And I also have some related episodes. In addition to episode 94 with Dr. Julie Miller-Jones, I have several grain-related episodes, some related to diabetes. And I recently did an episode on processed foods. And Julie, when you mentioned that interesting example with oatmeal, how the quick oatmeal versus the steel cut and what was the other one? The old-fashioned oatmeal. That's an example of a benefit of processing. So I encourage people to listen to that episode as well.
Another resource that you might want to add is my former colleague, Glenn Gazer, Julie, and I wrote another paper which looked at the relationship between glycemic index and body weight. That might be something that your listeners might want to take a look at, and I'll send you the link to the paper as well.
Yeah, thanks, Sid. I actually had Glenn on the show a couple times, so it might be something that we've touched on, but I definitely want to add that to the show notes. Thank you.
And they also might be interested in the University of Sydney International Glycemic Index table. And the reason that people might be interested is that it points out so dramatically that if you boil the rice for 12 minutes versus 10 minutes, you get a different amount. That basmati rices tend to be lower glycemic index, but there's some that aren't. Converted or parboiled rice tend to be lower, but there's some that aren't. And so I think that really points out quite dramatically how variable this index is and why using it for advising consumers is really, really problematic.
Yeah, so not a resource to use, but a resource to illustrate the point that we've been making. Thank you both so much for coming on the show and talking all things carbohydrate. I have learned so much, and I hope my listeners have as well. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you again for your time.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Always a pleasure. And I'd be happy to talk about fiber and resistant starch sometime.
Yeah, we'll have to have you back on for sure. And for everybody listening, as always, enjoy your food with health in mind and a side of potatoes. Till next time. So as you're talking and you're the physiologist, kind of a random side question, What do you think about fasting cardio? Is that something that you think is a good thing?
The interesting thing is, for some reason, and I don't know why it's gotten popular, but the important thing to recognize is that when you're fasted, really what you're doing is your hepatic glycogen is depleted or close to depleted. But you still have plenty of carbohydrates stored in your muscle, which is then going to get used up when you exercise. And so if you track people as they exercise, even after they come in from an overnight quote unquote fast, if you make them exercise at a higher intensity, their respiratory exchange ratio goes up right away. And they're oxidizing carbohydrates. So this idea that somehow this is going to allow you to burn more fat and control your body weight in some way, shape, or form more so than another form of exercise, it's probably not true.
Okay. Thank you for that little side conversation. I appreciate that.
For more information, visit soundbitesrd.com. Music by Dave Burke, produced by Jag in Detroit Podcasts.